Good afternoon and most welcome to 1476. I was a bit of a liar there, it's almost afternoon, but it's actually still morning here. 8 minutes to 12. I will continue where I left off in 1475. And I am currently at page 100 and, let's see here, 53. And we'll be getting into the Stimmungen, which are so hard to understand. That Stimmung is not a psychological mood. That needs to be well established, and I also mentioned in order to get that understanding you need to do the job, need to see how theoretical mood works, because you need theoretical mood, but not knowing how it works will make the division between theoretical mood and, for instance, psychological subjective mood inevitable. There you will have no other option. And that is also an indirect criticism of postmodernism that attacks the theoretical mood. It doesn't make any sense. So it's a bit into the second paragraph, and it starts with given. Given the attention that he pays to this phenomenon, not only in these lectures, but also in other writings on Aristotle from the same time, it is puzzling that he chooses to leave it out from Sein und Zeit. In his 1924-25 seminar on Aristotle and Plato, published under the title Platon, Sophistes, he explicitly addresses the Aristotelian analysis of the highest pleasure achieved in pure contemplation, of being in accordance with wisdom. It is as if, when gathering his material for Sein und Zeit, Heidegger chose to adopt a much more distanced and critical stance toward previous philosophy in general than what he demonstrates in his preparatory lectures An important aspect of this orientation is his critique of the theoretical attitude as such, as itself a source of self-deception and philosophical misconception. Do you note here that here he's addressing the theoretical attitude as such? It's not the workings of it. One could argue that precisely for this reason it would have been natural to address the explicit correlation established by Aristotle between the highest practice of the intellect and pleasure. And yet, in Sein und Zeit, Heidegger chooses a more Kierkegaardian track of reasoning. In which Aristotle is ultimately left behind as the father of a fateful theoretical attitude, trapped in the self-deception of its own independence. Once the necessary correlation between theorizing and a certain basic comportment is established, another question inevitably emerges on the horizon. Namely, what is the proper mood of philosophical thought and insight? And this question brings us right to the heart of the second aspect of Heidegger's theory of Stimmungen, as announced earlier. Initially, I remarked that this approach is dual. that he introduces the moods as a significant fact of human existence and world disclosure, but that they also function as a methodological step in his own account. It is this second aspect that is actualized at this stage. In order to see how this is the case, we must accept another observation of the existential analytic, namely that Dasein has a tendency to fall, as Heidegger puts it. This tendency is manifested in various ways. Most importantly, it is manifested in Dasein's tendency to understand itself not on the basis of its own possibilities, but from possibilities of other beings. In short, that it tends to objectify its own existence. But also that it tends to understand itself from the general and anonymous framework of collective human existence, from das Man. This is illustrated most clearly in the conception one has of one's own death. The truth of das Man is that one dies. Man stirbt. But the truth of existence is that one has one's own death to die. That finitude is always a personal and non-exchangeable destiny. by closing itself from this ultimately horrifying realization, Dasein also closes itself off from the philosophical truth of finitude, and thus from the truth of its own ontological structure. We become materialized, I would say. We become an input-output variety of Dasein, I would say. And we close ourselves off from the truth of our own ontological structure. This, I would say, this is my take, this happens when we unbeknownst apply also the theoretical mood to ourselves, or we think we are doing that. On its most fundamental level, this structure designates a condition that Dasein is itself. As such, it cannot be described and apprehended in neutral philosophical jargon. It demands that Dasein exposes itself to its own utmost possibility in a specific mood. In other words, and just as in Kierkegaard, the deepest truth of existential analytics is not accessible to the ordinary discursive, theoretically curious mood of existence. It requires an appropriate mood. And this mood is that of anxiety, or as Heidegger calls it, Angst. Of course, we can discuss this condition in the polite and restrained mood of a philosophical conference, and we can write about it, as Heidegger does himself, in the technical terminology of phenomenology, but as a particular and qualified form of world disclosure. It marks a sphere of its own. The access to which requires that we are seized by its overwhelming possibility. The qualified mood of angst thus marks a methodological step in the course of the existential analytic. This is one of the better things in Heidegger, and that is the understanding that when we understand ourselves not as Dasein towards death, but instead in the mood of looking at things, the theoretical mood, and by closing itself off from this ultimately horrifying realization, Dasein also closes itself off from the philosophical truth of finitude, and thus from the truth of its own ontological structure. On its most fundamental level, this structure designates a condition that Dasein is itself. So, there is a steep price to be paid of not understanding the theoretical mood. It will lead us to apply it in the wrong circumstances. And when we apply it to ourselves, we will not be able any longer to accept the finitude of our own existence. That, I would say, is completely inevitable. So, paradoxically enough, by not accepting finitude, we make ourselves material, non-human, non-soul bearing. And once more, you might see here how important it is to carefully and long time see what Heidegger is showing. It is not putting propositions on a plate for you to accept or not accept. He is not making statements of the world. There is a showing going on here. And we need to have the Dasein understand. Dasein is the only thing connected really to the inner and the outside simultaneously. You can also call it our true abode. When Heidegger brings up the Wanderer, who goes to his house on the mountain, he describes the return to the soul as well as the road there, the path. In other words, just as in Kierkegaard, the deepest truth of existential analytics is not accessible to ordinary, discursive, theoretically curious mood of existence. So, this is very Heraclitean, that finitude opens up for infinity. Goes to infinity. The infinity of Dasein and the soul can only be found in its finiteness. Going away from the finiteness will actually lead you to lose infinity. You will make yourself material, or a Daniel Dennett, composites of atoms or biological mass. Understanding that the theoretical mood is a specific mood will also lead to an understanding that you are both finite and infinite. And that these two factors are not on opposing walls. Here, in the beginning, they will be that. And this is very parallel how to Luther saw the difference between pathos and ratio. Not realizing, if we were to criticize good old Luther, not having in his Dasein to take in both. He was alternating between them. That is something that can build for despair. It's also written by Kierkegaard. So it's about disclosure of Dasein. You disclose Dasein when you start to understand the existential truths of reality. And one of those is definitely the theoretical mood. And I would say, applying it as he criticized Heidegger, applying it elsewhere needs to be criticized. But in its apt place, it has its place. Maybe a comment from Kalle here. Got the time, see here.
I agree with Hans Ruin and with Heidegger that we are always in a mood. But I'm asking why Heidegger lifts up, so to say, the mood of anxiety, almost as if anxiety is a good way of being. I don't like to be anxious myself. And Jesus, for instance, said, don't worry about tomorrow. Every day has its own problems. Myself, now I don't want to be worried and be anxious. I like to, utterly speaking, to be on a beach in Florida with a pina colada in my left hand and not be worrying. Or on a Greek island with a Greek yogurt with honey. I don't want to be worried, anxious. So why is anxious so good, positive in Heidegger?
Anxiety, yes. Well, he doesn't speak about being anxious, which implies anxious about something. This is an intransitive anxiety, if you like. It doesn't take an object. You're not afraid of something in particular. It's a bodily thing, but it's also a soulful thing. This, and I'm getting out on a thin ice here, but this is the beginning of the realization of infinity. And I believe, my take, maybe Jesus on the cross said, when he mentioned don't be anxious, he didn't mean anxious for your daily living or your daily health. It was the anxiousness of a greater value, because when it yields, infinity comes. This is how Kierkegaard saw it. Do not be afraid of the anxiety. Do not be afraid of finitude. Because it's exactly here everything opens up and becomes just wonderful. That's the path to yourself, to your soul, which is eternal. And I would say everywhere. Some concluding remark. Well, thank you very much, Kalle, for your nice comment, and I wish everyone who's listening and seeing a very pleasant, well, now we do have afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.